Prologue continued. Cyrene, a loss of self. Cyrene gasped awake into a world of violent shivers, sweat, and claps of thunder. Horrendous thunderstorms were just one of the unfortunate consequences of living on a remote, newly settled planet of perpetual storms and endless forests. One of the positives, however, was that they hadn't found her yet. Cyrene had been running for as long as she could remember, which totaled all of 1 year. She'd been told that biologically she was nearing her mid-20s, but some disaster or another had left her scarred and without memory. It had only been 2 months after that Alpha had first approached her, and only a day after Aline had done the same. The message they presented was clear: join us, or, well, join us. Cyrene hadn't liked those options, and so she ran, be it through the sewers of overpopulated industrial metropolitan planets, or entangled in the highest branches of the tallest trees of the forest world, or even hiding in the brush of the islands too small to be put on a globe. Here, she had been alone for 3 months, overlooking the small village where she bought her supplies that she couldn't find herself. She rolled out of her pathetic excuse for a bed and walked into the room that had nothing but a mirror hung on the wall and a bucket that rested beneath a leaking part of the roof that served as a sink. It never stopped raining here. Odd, that. She lit a candle, even though her eyes had already adjusted to the dark. Something about fire had always fascinated her. The way the flames danced to their own hypnotic rhythm, eternally devouring to fill an insatiable hunger until naught was left but the death of the flames and darkness. Had she the time, she could have stared into the fire for hours, lost in her own thoughts as the candle burned away in the flickering spasms common of cheap wax. Time, however, was never a luxury she could afford. Something had woken her, and it hadn't been the thunder. She didn't know what it was, but over the course of her long years, she'd learned it was better to be paranoid than caught. She stopped for only a moment to glance in the mirror. Her long, straight black hair flowed down to the middle of her back on her right, and down past her chest on her left. Her slanted bangs almost covered her left eye, but not quite. She had sharp Germanic features, but light brown skin. Her left eye glowed blood red, and her right eye radiated emerald green, two pinpricks of opposite light in the darkness. She wore only dark gray-blue shorts and a tattered, unfastened jacket of the same color. Something was off. She could feel it. The thunder didn't sound right. The rain was hitting the house all wrong. Even the howling wind carried something unusual in it. It was all wrong. She had to leave. Prologue continued. Alpha. There. I've always... The creature paused, looking for the right word as he stroked his chin with his sharp wolf-like claws. Appreciated what fear does to men, he said, walking towards the poor soul who was tied to a chair. Rain clattered against the roof, matching the sound of the man's chattering teeth. Aver was his name. Aver stared at the beast in front of him, trying to decide if he should be trying to figure out how to escape or how to wake up from this nightmare. The thing in front of him had presumably normal feet covered by combat boots, and legs by black cargo pants. Its uncovered midsection was lean and muscled, but had a strange gray hue to it. Its arms were human, except for its hands, which were elongated and thickly muscled, with 7-inch thick and jagged claws coming from every finger except the thumbs. Lastly was its face. In the light, it was the face of a man with very fatherly features and a graying beard with darker, almost black hair. It was a bit ragged, but not extremely long. Darkness, however, revealed a more terrifying truth, as in the shadows its chin, mouth, and nose formed a wolf-like snout, dripping green venom from its white canines. Its eyes looked like hypnotic swirling pools of glowing blood, and its voice carried a deep, smooth baritone that made Aver just want to trust it. Now, Aver, it said after thinking about it for a moment. No, it said, turning around, facing away from the man. Aver! It exclaimed, turning back around. That's it. Now Aver, it said, walking up to him and sitting backwards on the chair it had pulled up in front of him. You really want to tell me what I want to know, it finished as it rested its claws on Aver's thighs. I don't know, he stuttered. No one like that lives around here. I mean, a lot of people live here, so she could... He stopped mid-word as a sharp pain exploded in his eyes. Aver! It growled as its face half shifted to the form of a wolf, digging its claws into Aver's thighs like red-hot spikes. I don't want to hear lies! It snarled over the sound of Aver's yells. Now, the wolf said, pulling its claws out of Avera's thighs and acting more human again. Now, he said, stroking Avera's cheek with its bloodied claws. Shh, shh, it repeated until Avera's grunts turned to nothing but soft moans. Now this time, I want the truth. In fact, Avera, I'm pretty sure you want the truth. In fact, it said with emphasis as it stood again, knocking over the chair, I'm pretty sure that your pretty girlfriend... It paused, looking over at the woman who was tied up in the corner. Girlfriend or wife? It asked in a fatherly voice. Wife, she cried. Ah, I'm mistaken, it said, turning back to Avera. Your pretty wife, it said with emphasis. Congratulations, by the way, it added, sounding distracted. Now, where was I? It breathed, sounding slightly exasperated as it picked up the fallen chair and sat in front of Avera once again. Yes, it whispered. In fact, I'm pretty sure your pretty wife over there, he said, nodding in the woman's direction, would very much appreciate the truth. Avera glanced over at his wife before looking the beast straight in the eyes. Northeast of the village. There's a big hill with a house on top. There's a woman that lives up there. I can't be sure, but she fits the description, he said in a rapid pace. Good job, Avera, it said, closing its eyes for a moment. I'm very proud of you. Just don't hurt her, Avera said suddenly. She's a nice enough girl, he said with a pleading tone. I mean, she only comes around every now and again, but she's kind to the children, polite to everyone. There's no reason that... He kept babbling on, but it wasn't listening to him anymore. The wolf never liked this part, but part of him couldn't live without it. It was like a drug. It couldn't help itself. He turned around, slashing the jaw clear off the babbling Avera's face, leaving nothing but a gurgling stream of blood coming from his throat. His wife would have screamed, but she didn't really comprehend what had happened before the wolf had broken off a leg of the chair he had been sitting on and thrown it clear through her chest and into the wall behind her. She opened her mouth to gasp, or cry, or something, but her chest was gone, and with it her lungs. Her mouth slowly closed, and the stunned expression faded from her face along with the life in her eyes. The wolf turned around and walked over to the front door. He opened it gently and walked out into the rain, closing the door behind him. Humans, he whispered, walking into the wide muddy path that passed for a main road around there. They die so nicely. Everything was incredibly primitive on a new planet like this. As such, the law-keeping force was made up of colonists with nothing but a badge, a uniform, and a crude pre-colonial era weapon to identify them from the rest of the people. Around 20 of them showed up riding their horses on account of the fact that inexpensive vehicles and complex machinery couldn't stand up to the wet atmosphere around here. Ah, he said, cracking his neck and flexing his claws. I hate it when you come to me, it said, even though they couldn't hear it. Takes away the thrill of the hunt. It knew how cliched it was, but it howled at the moon anyway. Prologue continued. Aline, lying in lies. You can have anything. Aline paused, closing the distance between the two of them and resting her hands on his chest and standing on her toes to whisper in his ears. You can have everything. Really, it's tempting, but I can't. It's not allowed, he mumbled, trying to keep his bearings. But she was so beautiful. Her hair was like moonlight on a clear night, and her bright, icy blue eyes drew him in, and her fair skin had no blemishes to speak of. She had very feline features, from her slightly larger, slanted eyes to her high cheekbones. Even her pupils were more cat-like than human. Everything about her made him want her closer. Even the way she smelled was intoxicating, alluring, seeming to bring out some deep urge to have her near. Please, she whispered with her most innocently pleading voice. Who could it hurt? She asked, kissing his neck. No one, I don't think, he stuttered, closing his eyes as she lifted up his shirt and pushed him back onto the bed that was behind him. What the regs say? What he had wasn't much of a house, but that didn't stop him from calling it home. She had followed him back after his shift at the port. He knew all of the village locations, including how to get to the one that she so desperately needed to find. The information wasn't exactly a closely guarded secret, but the government building with all the relevant maps wouldn't be open until morning's light, and that would be far too late. Besides, this took far less effort. Oh, can't we just forget about the regs for a little while? She asked, straddling him and scratching down his chest softly. You'd be doing me a really big favor, she whispered, leaning down until she was almost touching his lips with her own. He could feel her cold breath against his lips, making him close his eyes and lose his own breath. I'd owe you one, she purred, stroking his left cheek with the back of her hand. Well, there's 2 places, he gasped, but I'd bet my life on it being the one in the east. It's only 10 clicks from here, he breathed deeply. There's a transport leaving there in the morning. I could get you a ticket. She moaned, pressing her lips up to his ear. Thank you so much, she said softly, biting the bottom of his ear. Now, what is it that you want? She asked, giving him a soft kiss before leaning back and looking him in the eyes as she gripped the bottom hem of her gray shirt. Untold riches? She asked, opening her eyes widely, drawing him into the endless depths of her icy blue irises. Power? She purred as he shook his head. She paused for a moment before lifting her shirt up the rest of the way and taking it off. Me? She asked innocently as he shook his head violently, signifying a yes. Then close your eyes and I'll, she started as he closed his eyes blissfully, give you everything you could possibly desire. She rolled her eyes as he shifted beneath her. Dream of me, you, she started as she brought a left hook slamming into the backside of his jaw right below the ear, knocking him out cold. Filthy, disgusting human. She almost growled the last word. She retrieved her shirt and threw it back on, getting off of the man and scratching his chest, leaving thin, jagged claw marks all in one fluid motion. Something to remember me by, she said, shrugging as she threw open the door. She hadn't really given him what he wanted, but she hadn't lied either. Right now, the man was having the best dream he'd ever have, but judging by the way his body was convulsing, it'd probably be the last dream he'd ever have. Right now, his rather small brain was receiving the strongest impulses she could have sent to it. The impulses and the feelings of the dream were so intense that he honestly couldn't tell the difference between dream and reality. In the end, his brain would inflict massive hemorrhaging on itself, just trying to sort everything out. All from one little kiss. There were only 2 villages in the east, and one was within 10 clicks, and she knew just how to get there. She left the house, leaving the door swinging behind her, and took off jogging towards the east. She'd be there within the hour. Prologue continued. Alpha. Mud and blood. 5 minutes later, there was only 1 horse and 3 men, and fire. Copious amounts of fire. The wolf had made quick work of most of the men. Bullets couldn't hit him. Well, it was possible, they just tended not to. He was strong, he was quick, and he was toying with them. The last 3 had no ammo to speak of, and even less training. 2 of them were holding their swords like clumsy schoolboys. The third was holding hers like a schoolgirl, on account of the fact that she was in fact a woman. It had been a long time since the wolf had seen swords being used with any sincerity, but it hadn't been all that long since he'd used one himself. He gripped it tightly in his left hand, letting his claws sink away. The muddy road had gotten muddier, if that was even possible. The rain was falling harder, and the village was mostly empty. In fact, only 7 people remained alive, one of which was out in the forest slowly bleeding to death from a severed femoral artery. 3 of them were in separate houses just waiting to burn to death or die from smoke inhalation. The last 3 had started running at the wolf, trying to be brave. The girl slipped through no fault of her own. She couldn't help the fact that the boys had pushed her down in their rush forward. The first one to get there swung diagonally at the wolf's right side. The wolf sidestepped the swing, and the boy went forward, completely off balance, before receiving a sharp blow to the back of the head by the wolf's sword. The second man was more cautious, trying to slow himself before getting to his opponent, but only managing to slip in the mud, landing on his ass. The wolf reacted quickly, bringing down his sword. The man responded with a simple swing diagonally upward, trying to catch the wolf's blade. The force of the slash knocked the sword right from the man's hand. The wolf arched his shoulders back, just for a moment, smiling down at the man before suddenly stepping to his left. The man who had taken the hilt to the back of the head had fully recovered and had tried to take the wolf out from behind, but instead found his sword embedded halfway through his friend's chest. The shock on his face was only increased by getting the wolf's sword stabbed so far through his stomach that the wolf's hand was coming out the other side. The wolf dropped his sword and pulled his hand back out while he laughed deeply. "You did well, boy," he laughed as he patted the first boy on the back. "You did well," he muttered, walking forward as the boy dropped to the ground. Prologue Continued. Aline, shall we dance? She emerged from the forest onto the main road just in time to see a boy dropping to the ground further down that very same road. The mud was now running with a mix of water and blood, and there wasn't a house that wasn't lit up in flames. The streets were littered with corpses, and only the howling of the raging wind masked the sounds of screams, and with it came the smell of death and burning flesh. Damn, she whispered to herself as she kept up a quick pace, walking towards the only two survivors. One of them, a blonde girl, was in the process of being pulled off the ground by the hair. The other, whom she recognized all too well, was drawing his clawed fist back, preparing to do something that wasn't going to be pleasant. She was only 20 meters away at this point. She could see the fear through the mud and blood on the girl's young face. She was whimpering softly, trying to look the beast in the eyes. "There'll be no need for that, Alpha," Aline called out, causing the beast to turn towards her. "And why the hell not?" he asked, looking back towards the voice. "We both know where she's at," she said, gesturing towards the hill in the distance. "Now all that's left is to see who gets her first. The human doesn't need to die." "No, she doesn't need to," he said, snarling as he turned back towards the girl. "She doesn't need to live either," he said, drawing his fist back again. The girl closed her eyes tightly this time as he lunged at her throat, grasping onto it with his claws and ripping out everything vital. The girl's eyes shot open as Alpha dropped her back into the mud. She arced her back, grasping at her non-existent throat, making a faint clicking sound as she tried to scream or breathe. She squirmed around in the mud for a few moments before Alpha finished it by crushing her chest beneath his boot. "You really are twisted," the woman called out to Alpha, completely unfazed by the gore. "Come now, Aline," he taunted, turning back towards her, flexing his bloodied hand. "Like you haven't had a little necessary fun." "I only kill when I need to," she spat, looking at him with contempt. "As do I," he responded smoothly. "Maybe I just have different needs than you." He dropped down into a squat, washing his hands in a puddle at his feet and picking up his sword again. "That dock worker I left behind for you. He's still alive?" Alpha saw the hesitation in her eyes. Now that wasn't necessary. "Can't leave any witnesses," she responded, drawing her own sword with her right hand. "I'll admit I have my vices, but at least he died cleanly," she said with a soft laugh. "And he enjoyed the hell out of it." "Ah, killing with kindness," Alpha laughed. "But you didn't come here to pit my morality against yours. You want—" "The girl," she interrupted. "She's ours. Leave now or—" "Child, I've heard this speech before," he said, cutting her off with a friendly growl. "Let's just skip the part where you tell me no, and get straight to the part where I prove you wrong," he said as he stood up. "I do hope you've gotten better since the last time we danced." "Infinitely," she responded tersely. "Shall we?" he asked, politely gesturing. "Fuck you," Aline responded, walking towards him and swinging her sword in a downward slash. Alpha caught the sword, slashing upwards. The blades met with a clap louder than the thunder that eluded the night. "Now that," Alpha grunted, straining against Aline's blade, "that wasn't very polite." Two very different hunters sent after the same prey. It was inevitable that both would reach the objective. After all, the leader of the pack never came back empty-handed, and nor did the feline fatale. Of course, never is almost as much of an exaggeration as always. Never accurate, but always used. I digress. So what happened? Ah, yes, what happened indeed. What happened was what must happen. Neither returned empty-handed, and the repercussions would be felt across an empire, a republic, and a universe, eventually. A fire gifted to both sides, one ruby and the other sapphire. No one ever bothered to ask what happened to the emerald left behind. Odd that. The observations of an over-observed observationist. Prologue continued. Cyrene. Options. She had her stuff packed and ready. The bag at the foot of her bed was everything that she owned. She was already dressed for the trip. She wore black cargo pants and black combat boots. Her gray shirt was ragged and ripped, and her gray-blue jacket was still unfastened. She had 2 6-inch daggers, one strapped to each of her thighs. She had her pistol tucked into the back of her pants, only 4 bullets left in the magazine. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her bangs still almost covered her eyes. She threw the sack over her shoulder and walked over to the door. She took a breath and then threw it open. Outside, she found out why everything was so wrong. She drew her pistol, watching two beings expertly fighting with swords. The movements were fluid, and the dance was almost beautiful. Every time the swords clashed, thunder echoed throughout the night, and rain exploded in every direction around them. She dropped her sack and cocked her gun, not sure who to aim at quite yet. Their blades locked again as she fired a shot between their heads. They both turned simultaneously, still pushing against each other's blades. "Cyrene," Aline grunted. "Go back inside, this doesn't—" Yeah, Cyrene started. "Fuck you, lady." "Oh," Alpha chimed in. "She's got a bit of a bite," he growled. "Both of you shut up," she yelled, firing another shot between them. "I'm leaving. Once I'm gone, you can go on killing each other." "That's not going to be an option, sweetheart," Alpha said as calmly as he could. "Like hell it's not," she began, when suddenly a red beam produced from one of Alpha's hands, contacting Cyrene in the diaphragm. She gasped for air as she dropped her gun, and her arms fell slack at her sides. Aline responded by producing a green beam from one of her hands. When it contacted, Cyrene cried out with whatever air she had left before falling to her knees, gasping raggedly as though she'd been shot in both lungs. Her mouth hung open as the color faded from her skin and eyes. The beams grew brighter, Alpha's blood red, and Aline's emerald green. Alpha couldn't help but notice the unusual color. It was supposed to be blue, but what did it matter? Cyrene was spent. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't keep her eyes open, and she couldn't do anything as the lights faded along with everything else. She didn't know if she was going to wake up again, but for some reason, she couldn't convince herself to care. Prologue continued. Frigid. Spirit. The strike came high, and she blocked it with her knives in an X, catching his swords between. She thought she'd done something quite brilliant until his knee was brought straight up against her. He was much taller, and as such his knee contacted with her diaphragm, knocking the wind clear out of her. She coughed as she lay on her back, but kept her grasp on her knives. He came down with another strike aimed at her on the ground. She rolled right, getting onto her hands and knees, but he recovered too quickly, raising his right steel-toed boot into her rib cage, throwing her onto her back and fracturing multiple ribs with a resounding crack. She cried out, grasping her right side and coughing up blood that mixed into the wet mud beneath her. She lay on the ground only momentarily, still holding her knives and rolling over again, standing more quickly. "Spirit," the man said, sheathing his sword. "You have spirit, and that's very important," he finished in a fatherly tone. She spat her blood in his face in return. He arched his back, laughing as his bones began cracking and his shoulders grew broader and his hands became elongated and more muscular, growing long, jagged claws. His skin grew pale and gray, and his nose, mouth, and chin formed into a wolf-like snout as his ears grew longer and sharper. "Care to try again?" it snarled. "Yeah, you could definitely use the practice," she said with a small laugh as she smiled through her fear. She ran at him with all the courage she could muster. He awaited her with patience and precision. She tried to stab at his chest, but he caught her by the wrists, bringing her hands closer and closer together until he held them with only one hand. He lifted them above her, higher and higher, until her feet were left the ground, and her face was level with his. He snarled at her face, getting venom and saliva all over her. She responded by growling back in the most mocking fashion she could, spitting on his face before bursting into laughter. He grasped her wrists harder, forcing his claws into her, which caused her laughter to turn to something closer to cries. "Now that's the spirit," he growled, drawing his right arm back. She saw it coming, and laughed as hard as she could before he drew long gashes across her stomach and lower chest. She wore no armor, so the claws ripped through her like a knife through butter. She screamed before closing her mouth tightly, not allowing anything to escape. He gripped her head with his free hand, digging his hands into her skin as she screamed again. He brought them closer together as he cut her forehead, eyelids, and cheeks, stopping just before her nose. "Oh, what's the point?" it snarled as her daggers dropped from her hands, and he dropped her to the ground. She crumpled once again, laughing softly. "Get on with it," she demanded, rolling onto her back as she smiled through the blood that poured down her face. "I like playing with my food," he smiled as his lips curled up, exposing his razor-sharp teeth. He drew back his boot, kicking her in her already cracked ribs, but not hard enough to kill. She cried out loudly as he kicked again and again, somewhere different every time. She reached for her daggers with her right hand, only to have it crush beneath his boot. He couldn't tell if she was whimpering or... No, the smile told him that it was still a laugh. "Spirit," he growled. "You have spirit." She heard him walking away. Her eyes were too bruised and bloodied to open, so she grasped about in the mud, reaching for her daggers. She heard footsteps returning and grasped more frantically, but she couldn't find the dagger. Instead of a boot crushing her wrist, she felt a hand grasp. It then gentled. "Calm yourself, girl," a voice said gently. Rain had started to fall gently, washing away some of the blood, but more took its place. "Healer!" the voice yelled. She felt her shirt being taken off as the man took stock of her wounds. She felt pressure being applied to her midsection as a dry cloth was put over it. He yelled for the healer one more time, so far as her consciousness could tell. "Friend, or..." she started but couldn't continue. "You fought the wolf?" he responded kindly. "No," she gasped as she began coughing and laughing softly. "He just killed me slowly. He tried to hush her, but she carried on anyway. "I just watched." He laughed quietly before pulling hair that was sticking to the blood on her face away. "You're alive?" "Barely," she whispered back as she closed her eyes. "With the wolf, though. That is something of a remarkable feat." She didn't respond. The man checked for a pulse. She was unconscious, but alive. "What have you got there, Fairs?" the man called as he emerged from the brush with 4 others standing in mud-stained blue uniforms. "Someone that needs healing," Fairs called back from the ground. "That's true," the man answered. "But the question is she our someone to heal?" "She survived the wolf." "Barely," the man retorted. "You might like her, Caden." Fairs laughed as the healers took her from him on the ground. Fairs patted dirt and mud off of his uniform. "Why is that?" he asked, leading Fairs' horse to him. "Her smart ass," he said, gesturing back to the bloody mess behind him, "is as..." He paused for a moment, thinking about it. "It's almost as untacked as yours."